purpose of Psalm 2 is to serve as part 2 of the introduction to the Psalms. Part 1 was Psalm 1. And in Psalm 1:1, notice he uses the phrase, how blessed. And then in Psalm 2, that phrase comes up again in verse 12, how blessed. Psalm 1 was about the blessedness of the man or woman who submits themselves to the wisdom or teaching or Torah of God. Psalm 2 is about the blessedness of the man or woman who submits themselves to God's king. And that's because we don't just need God's wisdom and teaching. We also need God's king to be our spiritual leader, to show us what it looks like to walk in wisdom, and to give us guidance in the teachings of God, and also to hold us accountable when we fail to walk according to those teachings. In fact, in Psalm 1, the wicked are pictured as chaff blown away by the wind of God's judgment. And in Psalm 2, it's God's king who's pictured as pouring out the judgment on the wicked, shattering them like earthenware in verse 9. And just the idea that we need God's king to be our leader, that's really humbling, and it rubs people the wrong way because most people want to be the king of their own lives. They don't want God's king telling them what to do, and so they rebel against his reign. And that's what Psalm 2 is all about. The nations are in an uproar. The peoples are devising plots against God's king to keep him from reigning over them. And yet God mocks their feeble attempts. He laughs at their attempts to stop him from carrying out his purpose of installing his king. When I was a kid, for fun, I would wrap my arms and legs around my dad's leg and try to stop him from walking. But he would just look down at me and laugh at my feeble attempts, and he would keep walking, basically just lifting me off the ground with his leg and moving forward with me still wrapped around his leg. And that's what it's like when people try to thwart God's purposes and stop his king from reigning over them. God looks down and laughs, and he continues to fulfill his purpose despite their efforts to stop him. And so the practice part of this psalm is verse 12. We need to do homage to the Son. We need to submit to his king. Some translations say kiss the Son. It's a kiss of allegiance. It's like kissing the ring. We need to submit to Jesus even when it's hard, even when he tells us to do things that we don't want to do and that require sacrifice of us. Why? Because it's actually a blessing to have such a wise king over us, because a king who leads us in the wisdom of God is going to make us like trees firmly planted by streams of water. And he's going to make us blessed, and we'll have the favor of God upon us. Also, kings were military leaders back then. So this king is going to lead us in battle and conquer all of our enemies. So while it may be difficult sometimes to submit to Jesus because he tells us to do hard things, it's even more difficult to rebel against him, because then we become like the wicked that end up mocked by God, and we do so at our own peril. One writer said, "There is no refuge from him. There is only refuge in him." Now, as far as prophecy goes, this was written by David. We know that from Acts chapter 4. And David understood what this psalm was about because Saul tried to stop God from installing David, his anointed, on the throne. And Saul got destroyed for it. So did Absalom. And so did many of the Gentile nations who David conquered militarily. All these people who tried to stop God's plan, they were thwarted, and God put his king, David, on the throne anyway. But ultimately, this is about Jesus, and he is the ultimate son and king that we need to submit to. Verse 7, "You are my son." That's quoted by God when Jesus comes up out of the waters of baptism. In Acts 13, it's quoted in connection with Jesus' resurrection. In Acts 4, the apostles realized Pilate and the Jews, they tried to rebel against God's king by putting him on a cross, and yet they were judged for it, and Jesus came out victorious, and God fulfilled his plans anyway. This leads us to praise God for giving us this perfectly righteous and wise King Jesus to be our spiritual leader. And in fact, this is why this is such a great introduction to the Psalms, because there's a lot of lamenting going on in the Psalms, but there's also a lot of praise, because the Jews understood no matter how bad things get, God is going to give us the Messiah. He's going to install his king who's going to make all things right. And that leads us to praise God the way they did. And our prayer today is, God, help me to submit to King Jesus, even when it's inconvenient and difficult. And help me thank you every day for such a godly king. I'll see you tomorrow in Psalm 3.